here. All right, well, we still have people coming into the room, but in the interest of time, we're going to get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Fitzsimons. I'm Vice President of Leadership and Engagement at Lead San Diego, an affiliate of the San Diego Regional Chamber of Commerce. Welcome to Leading in a New Reality in partnership with Jones, a company whose mission is to develop leaders and human systems that counter oppression through diversity, inclusion, and organizational effectiveness. At Lead San Diego, our mission is to connect, educate, and empower leaders for positive change. And that's what we're trying to do here today, because we all need to be agents of change, now more than ever. Our president and CEO, Jerry Sanders, is here with us, and he'd like to say a few words. Jerry?
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'd like to thank Dr. Jones and Professor Lewis for helping to guide us through a discussion. And I'd say these are unprecedented times, but we've been through this over and over and over again. We've been through it in Watts and Detroit, in LA again, and we've seen it happen in Ferguson. And each time we say that we're going to listen, we're going to make change, we're going to understand the frustration, we're going to make changes, and we don't do it. And they're difficult discussions to have. And I don't think that we know how to do that. And I also think that we have such a short attention span. We just hope things go back to whatever was normal before. And I think this time we can see the pain, we can see the rage, we can understand the issues much better from an institutional point of view. And I think the fact that we've got Dr. Jones and Professor Lewis willing to help us, I'd just like to tell you, the people watching, you're part of a group of well over 300, which shows how needed this discussion is. And it's going to be a difficult discussion for many of us, but it's a discussion we need to listen to, and then we need to learn how to participate in, and we need to learn how to lead those discussions with others. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Jones.
Thank you. Elizabeth.
Yes. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you for being here. We appreciate it. So welcome, everybody. You know that it's been a little over a week now since a Minneapolis police officer killed George Floyd, which was the latest in a long line of African-American unarmed men killed by police. And it came right on the heels of Breonna Taylor, who was killed by police while sleeping at home, and right after Ahmaud Arbery, who was killed by 3 white men while he was out for a jog in his neighborhood. And it came the day after Amy Cooper, who is white, called the police in Central Park, falsely reporting that Christian Cooper, who is Black, was threatening her life. Now, since George Floyd's death, there have been demonstrations across the country forcing some long overdue examination of policing practices, systemic racism, and white supremacy. All of this against the backdrop of a pandemic that has claimed the lives of more than 100,000 people in our country, with African-American and LatinX communities bearing the brunt of these losses. And millions are unemployed. It can feel like our country is unraveling. I think it also feels like an opportunity, as Jerry said. Could this be a turning point? Today, we're going to talk about what's going on and how we as leaders of teams and organizations and families can be part of the change that our country so desperately needs. And we have 2 powerful leaders and teachers here to help us understand and act. Before we get started, you know that this webinar is being recorded, so we'll be able to send it out to you and you can share it with your friends. Please use the chat button to send us your questions. My colleague and program manager, Kim Wynn, is at the controls and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. We'll spend about 25 minutes in conversation with our guests and then take questions from you for about another 25. I'm so honored to welcome our guests today. Starla Lewis is Professor Emeritus at Mesa College and a transformational speaker and life coach who has developed lectures and facilitated seminars in the areas of diversity, life mastery, and women's empowerment, both nationally and internationally. She is the founder and CEO of CEL, which stands for Celebration of Everlasting Life and Love Consulting. Professor Lewis has more than 40 years of research and experience in African-American studies. Oral communications and women's studies have enhanced her ability to engage diverse communities. She is the author and illustrator of Sun Kisses, a multicultural, multilingual coloring book for children and adults. She is the co-creator and facilitator of Woman's Worth, Reclaiming Our Divinity and Our Destiny, and co-author of I Am, My Own Self-Validation. Professor Lewis is a 7-time recipient of the Mesa College Teacher of the Year Award, a 2015 Women's Hall of Fame honoree, and was recognized by KPBS as a local hero. Through her work, she affirms that all people are brilliant, powerful, limitless, love. Welcome, Starla Lewis. Stephen Jones is an author, national speaker, and the chief executive officer of our partner, Jones. Nationally known as one of America's top experts in diversity, Dr. Jones holds a bachelor's degree in computer science, a master's in multicultural counseling, along with a master's and PhD in industrial organizational psychology. Dr. Jones is in the process of completing his second book titled The Inclusive Workplace, Leading Through New Lenses in the 21st Century. Dr. Jones has served as a national diversity advisor to Honda, Hyundai, MRC Capital, and Sempra Energy. In addition, he and the Jones team of consultants have provided consulting and training services for organizations such as the Getty and Kodak and Qualcomm and so many others. He currently serves on the executive committee of the board of directors of Lead San Diego, where he gives of his time and talent as a thought partner, speaker, and mentor. Welcome, Stephen Jones.
Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Jerry, for having me, and my mentor and lifelong colleague of about since 1987, Professor Starla Lewis. So we have been in this work and on this journey together for a significant amount of time.
Well, maybe that's where we can start, is with your shared work in this space and calling upon your years of experience. Dr. Jones, you shared with me that back in 1992, you and Professor Lewis partnered on a town hall for college students after the LA riots, and that was after a jury acquitted 4 LA police officers of excessive force in the beating and arrest of Rodney King, which was all recorded on video. If we could start by, can you help us understand the similarities and the differences between what happened then and what is happening now?
Absolutely, Elizabeth. I think that it's sad that this is a full circle moment for myself and Professor Lewis and for many other people. And Jerry, you gave examples in your opening of going on before that, even with the Watts riots. And, this is a cycle and a circle that we unfortunately come back to all too often in our world, really. And in 1992, after the verdict of the beating of Rodney King that was videotaped, and I think that one is the commonality, right? There was a videotaping. The difference is that, of course, we saw a man's life be taken in the death of and killing of George Floyd, as he cried and gave a play-by-play on his depleting life force, right? And was not heard, was not listened to. And I think that for me, the connection around the videotape, first off, I want to say that in both, well, at least in the Rodney King situation, when the videotape happened of the beating of Rodney King, there were not riots. That many people said, okay, this time we got him, right? This time it's on videotape and they can't deny that this happened. It was after the verdict that came out in the Rodney case situation that people said, this is unacceptable. And I will tell you, I was having a conversation with someone earlier, and I was saying to them that they were talking about hope and how much hope they had for change to happen this time. And I said to them that hope for some people can feel like a privilege. Because I remember after watching the video of Rodney King, I remember feeling hopeful because they had a video. And when the officers were not charged in 1992, I remember being upset with myself that I had allowed myself to hope that the system would be fair in that situation. And so I find many people, including myself today, are skeptically holding on to hope because there's some vulnerability in that hope, right? And I would say that both in 1992 and today, when people took to the streets to march, right, that it was a diverse group of people in both situations, right? It was a diverse group of people around the country then that were marching, and it is a diverse group of people today, right? And I think that the idea of people having an outcry because the feeling that the justice system meant just us for so many people, especially in the Black community in 1992. And I think there's a feeling today where that same feeling is still accurate today. But I think the difference today includes that we just sent 2 astronauts to the International Space Station. So we can figure that out, but we're challenged to figure this out, right? We also are still in the throes of a global pandemic where we also just experienced the world moving in some unprecedented ways to keep each other safe, to keep ourselves safe. We distance ourselves from our parents, our grandparents, our loved ones. We sheltered in place, right? We listened to the television to tell us what we should or shouldn't do to stay safe. And we listen for trusted people to help us understand what individual actions to take to keep ourselves and others safe, right? And I think in a sense, if we think about the COVID-19 as the global pandemic that it is, and then we parallel racism to the global pandemic that it is, then the question becomes, what unprecedented actions are we willing to take both individually and institutionally going forward to keep ourselves safe, and especially to keep the Black community and Black men and women safe when going out every day and in our encounters with police and law enforcement.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Professor Lewis, we were having a little bit of technical issues with her, and I just want to check in and see if we have audio with the professor.
Not quite yet. We're still working on it.
Okay, that's okay. Dr. Jones, you have been sharing your observations on social media, and recently on Facebook you posted about your frustrations with the coverage of the protests. Can you share what you have been noticing, and what do we need to be aware of as we're consuming that news coverage?
Absolutely. So I think part of, as I'm watching the media, I'm watching and listening for the acknowledgement of the pain, because that is a big part of what happened. That was part of the human experience, right? As people, the world, watch one human being keep his knee on the neck of another human being. In the martial arts world, I understand they call this a blood choke. Right? And the idea that one human being was calling out for another, I think part of why the world has moved into action is because, and why parents are having to describe to their children. We were talking with one of our clients, and one, especially in COVID, as we're all sheltering in place together, one person talked about her 7-year-old daughter asking her, and this was a white woman talking about her 7-year-old white child, asking her, "Mom, why did that man do that? Right? Why didn't he take his knee off of that man's neck?" Right? And the idea becoming, how do you explain that? Right? And that to me is part of why when people talk about all life matters, right? In this case, how do you tell your daughter or your child, in that case, that man did not think that this Black life mattered? And that's part of the difference, and why many people are saying the slogan of Black Lives Matter becomes so critical, because in these types of situations, the humanity of African Americans, as it has historically, right, gets viewed from an inhumane lens, and we will lose that. So one, I'm watching to see the acknowledgement of the pain. And then I'm also watching to see whether the messaging around the protests are occurring, because I'm watching the media cover the protests as peaceful or violent, right? Versus going, well, why aren't we hearing what the speakers are saying during the protests? Because that's the message and that's the lesson. And then I'm also listening to the way people are responding to what's happening around the world. I saw this meme that said, some people say it's horrible that an innocent Black man was killed, but destroying property has got to stop. And how do we change that, the order of that statement, to maybe be, it's horrible that property is being destroyed, but the killing of innocent Black men has got to stop. Right? And so that for me is some of what I'm watching. How you doing, Professor Lewis?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Chime in, Starla.
Well, what can I say that you haven't said other than the fact that this is just a reality check? When I hear people say things getting back to normal, that doesn't give me much comfort, because we're in our normal. This is what our normal looks like. And now the world is looking at our normal. So I think it's really important to understand that, and that as American citizens, we've all gone to school, and yet we didn't learn about America. We learned bits and pieces, but we didn't learn the totality of the story. And as African Americans, we're very clear, because we're not in the story other than picking a little cotton. So our challenge, look at the best of ourselves. And in doing that, then we begin to get closer and closer to truth and understanding what has happened in America. I can't help but think, if you talked about the riot with Rodney King verdict, but I go back to the Martin Luther King riot, when the man of peace, asking America to look at its conscience and do the right thing for all of humanity, was assassinated. And so that was the first major burning of cities in America. And it came from that place of not rage, but pain. And part of our challenge is to understand, as Dr. King, that a riot is simply the voice of the, and if you don't listen, they get louder and louder and louder. Right. Then they get violent, because they're trying to be heard, not because they're trying to destroy their neighborhood or to destroy the country. They're trying to be heard.
Yeah, yeah.
Professor,
and I think
I'm sorry, I was going to ask you, Professor, how is this time different? How is this moment different from then and different from the early 90s with Rodney King? Or does it feel different to you?
It feels a little different, but the thing that feels most different is, I think, more than in the 1968, I think white people are hearing it. I mean, white people had to watch an assassination on television. And so they couldn't deny what their eyes were forcing them to see. White people got to hear a Black man begging I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. White people got to hear a Black man begging for his mama. And when you hear that as a Black woman, as a Black mother, that is our greatest fear, is that someone's gonna snuff out the life of our sons, our husbands, our brothers, our uncles, our friends. And so it brought it to a height because it made it so very undeniably.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit more, Professor, about people understanding something that isn't their own experience? How do you help people understand beyond their own experience?
Well, I think it is their experience.
Yeah.
They just don't know it.
Yes.
You know, we are all human beings. When humanity is in pain, we're in pain, whether it's in our neighborhood, whether it's in our country, because it's in our world. And we know that we have a compassionate heart because as members of American society, we donate to little kids in Africa and on reservations and all kinds of people that don't live here.
Yeah.
But we ignore the fact that often what we're trying to stop in other countries, we're actually doing here and have done it for hundreds of years. And so that's bringing it to our consciousness. You know, we all want our daddy and our mama to be just the best people. And then we grow up and then we find out, oops, they made some mistakes and oops, they did some things that they was hiding from us. And, you know, well, our country's the same way. It's an amazing country. At the same time, it's hidden a lot of its ugly stuff. And we have to shed light on that so that we don't repeat it.
Yeah. I think the other part for me to build on what you're saying, Starla, is I think the idea of understanding an experience that I haven't lived for me is right next to understanding the way the system of institutionalized racism works, right? And I think this is why Amy Cooper's example becomes so significant, because as I saw Amy Cooper as, I'll just say, an average white person, you know, playing with her dog in the park, and let's say, you know, average Black man, well, maybe not average, the brother was bird watching, but, you know, I'm just saying, but the idea that you know, an African-American man would ask her to put her dog on a leash. And the idea that Amy Cooper had enough of an understanding, not about her own or the lived experience of someone else, she understood her role in the system of institutionalized racism to where she knew if she made a call and not just said, a man is threatening me, but she knew to say, an African-American man is threatening me. She knew her relationship to the police as a white woman calling the police. She knew the police's relationship with a Black man. She knew the history of, or knew that there was a dynamic between a Black man and her as a white woman. And she made a call to weaponize the police. And in the call, when she said it the first time, she realized that she might not trigger the system enough. So she increased the fear in her voice and the trepidation in her voice to mobilize, hoping that an Officer Chauvin-like person would show up in the park where she would be believed and potentially he would lose his life. And so there's one part to me that says, walking in someone else's moccasins, right? Walking in understanding and empathizing with someone else's experience is one part of the criteria. But even if I don't walk in someone else's experience and I understand my experience and my part in the system and the privilege that I have, you know, in that system, that's another part of the work that needs to be done, right? So that people understand. And I'm going to just quickly give an example of the COVID-19. I have learned more about the healthcare and the hospital system in the world and in this country than I ever knew before, right? Because I thought 850 beds were a lot of beds, only to learn that that would not, right, handle the need if we did not manage and flatten the curve of the COVID-19 virus. And so there was a way that we were, as a country, educated about our healthcare system, and then asked to take individual actions so we didn't overwhelm the system, right? And so to me, there's a parallel there that says, how do we, and this is part of what we can do section, right? How can we educate ourselves to understand the institutionalization of racism? Because it played out in our healthcare system, right, where we saw the disproportionate inequalities in healthcare, right, and how COVID impacted that. But how can we grow our understanding of the systemic parts of racism so that we can understand how our individual actions either flatten the curve of racism or grow the curve of racism?
And I think also we have to look inside of ourselves. You can't live in a system without taking on some of the beliefs, values, attitudes, opinions, and behaviors of that system. And so I, as an African-American woman, I have to look at my own internalized white supremacy. I've been taught to believe about the supremacy of white people. How am I acting that out in my own life, in my own choices? You know, why do Black people say we're in a good neighborhood and that means I got to move away from Black people? Where does that thought form come from? And so I think all of us need to go in as well as out.
That's right.
See what parts of belief systems have I unconsciously thought about? Do I really believe that blondes are more beautiful than brunettes? And is that why my hair is blonde? Or do I really want to play with my hair and do something fun? See, these are the questions we don't even ask ourselves.
What are some changes that we can make on an interpersonal level and as leaders of teams and organizations at an organizational level? And maybe you can give us some examples of some of the organizational change that has caught your attention over the last week.
Before you go organizational, Stephen, I'd like to say on a personal level. There is an African proverb that says, not to know is bad, but not to wish to know is worse. And I think that's part of our challenge, to be able to want to know, to be able to do some extra work. You know, teachers will say, oh, I don't have time to teach cultural studies and diversity. I just don't have time. Well, read a book and let the book be about cultural diversity and be teaching reading. You see, we can do very basic things to allow our minds and our behaviors to grow through the knowledge that we're willing to go out and seek and be open to receive. You know, we don't want to know that there's bad things happening in the Black community, because then they say, well, what can I do about it? Then we start to feel bad. But the reality is we can all do something. We can't do everything, but we can figure out how to do.
Yeah, I think that's powerful, Starla, because, you know, we say if you have a brain, you have bias, right? And part of our work includes looking at and examining some of the ways that both conscious and unconscious biases cause us to move towards some people and move away or stay neutral regarding others, right? And so this idea of understanding and looking at ourselves, to your point, Starla, and looking at my own actions, holding myself accountable, and not expecting myself to be perfect in this process. We were saying with one organization, as we were talking to some of their employees who just and I think this is what one example of what leaders can do is create a space for your employees just to get together via Zoom or some other platform, just to say, how are you doing? How are you processing this? You know, again, we have to create spaces for us to be human and to tap into our humanity around seeing another human's life be taken right in front of us. Right? And so creating the space where people can say, I don't know what to say. I just am pissed off, hurt, sad, and that's it. Right? And so it's, I think, not always about having the right words to say, but it's about tapping into the emotions that we're having, because in order to not see someone as human, I have to disconnect myself from my own humanity. Right? And so for me, part of leaders creating, we're seeing leaders and organizations do a number of things. One, putting out statements. Leaders are putting out statements about the unacceptability of the pattern of racism that we have just seen and the loss of Black lives. During this time, silence equals violence. Right? If we are not saying and communicating, then people assume we don't know or we don't care. Right? So even saying, again, I don't have the words for it. All I know is I'm just on top of COVID-19 and seeing this, inhumane action occurring. I'm just devastated and I'm stuck, for example. Right? There's another part, which is, so organizations, leaders, executives are putting out a commitment statement. The second part is creating listening sessions for people to talk with each other about how they're being impacted. Because the likelihood is, and we had another conversation we were having where one person said, working on these sales numbers do not seem significant right now. Right? I can't even get my head around work because my heart is just so hurt and heavy. Starla?
I wanted to add listening and learning sessions.
Yeah.
It's not just about opinion. We have a history.
Yeah.
We have laws.
Mm-hmm.
When I think of, when I hear all of the media talking about the riots and the damage to property and the numbers and in dollars, et cetera, as an African-American human being who knows her history, who knows that I live in a society that defined me as 3/5 of a human being, that 3/5 of a human being comes out when I hear property, destruction. And I'm saying people are dying. He died one day, the very next day in Tennessee, another young brother died.
Yeah.
Before, a young man just jogging in the park was killed by two white men, a father and son. I mean, and they didn't feel that they were really going to be prosecuted. When you look at the history, when you know it, you know that the people who killed Emmett Till got off in an hour after, and then years later, the wife says, "Oh, I made it all up." Yeah. And so we, just like the woman in the park.
That's right.
And it's important to understand that people don't know each other's stories. We don't know each other's history. And when you take all this diversity that is America and you learn each other's stories, you get to see a whole picture. Yeah. And then you realize that we can have compassion and empathy. Maybe you didn't have this happen, but you had that happen. Right. And that was just like this for you. Right. You see what I'm saying? That's when we can see ourselves in each other's experiences, in each other's desires, in each other's passion, just think of how we treated people who we thought were from the Middle East, because many weren't, how we beat them and called them names just because somebody bombed what we thought was our country and didn't understand it was there too.
Yes.
Because they were Americans too.
Yeah.
You see, it's not them and us, it's just us.
Yeah.
And we haven't learned enough about the diversity of our country from its inception.
Yeah.
You see, to be able to see ourselves in one another and to see ourselves in each other's plight. As a woman, as a woman in America, and we know that sexism is way older than racism. Mm-hmm. We know that. How can I, as a woman, not see the beauty in another woman?
Oh, we can't hear your mic.
Child. And yet memory of racism as a child was watching mother throw rocks and bricks at children on buses and calling them niggas and trying to block their access to education. Mm-hmm. You see, and that wasn't a long time ago. Mm-hmm. And our children today, if you listen to Black children, they will tell you that education is hazardous to their health.
That's right.
Their mental health. Why? Because they're not learning about themselves.
Yeah.
They're learning everybody else did great things and you picked a little cotton. That's not education. So we're challenged that way.
Yeah.
Truth is what's going to get us together.
Yeah. Oh.
Dr. Jones and Professor Lewis, we have a question from Jasmine Sadler, and she asks, how should Black people respond when asked by white people, what is the best way for me to help?
Yeah. You want to go first, Starla, or would you like me to?
Well, educate yourself and educate please. Educate yourself, educate your neighbors, have conversations with your Black friends, and give them permission to tell you the truth. Because too often we have white friends and we are politically correct, and we don't tell you about our hurts, our pains, our fears, our experiences on our job, and moving through the stores, moving through the communities. When we talk about all these places where things are happening and you think, well, those are places that we might feel comfortable living. We don't feel comfortable living any place in America. We don't feel safe just, oh, I'm going to cross country and here and there. We don't feel safe. We some of us have a little money. All those things that are supposed to make us free, those aren't the things that make us free. The only thing that makes us free is when we declare and exercise our freedom.
Yeah, I'll build on that to say that I think, and Starla, I'll connect to something you said earlier. I think one of the things when people ask, how can I help? I find that it's important to have a place where white people talk to other white people about the challenges about. I know that when Starla and I do and have done work in the past around sexism and racism, I know there are things that we as men say in each other's company that we would not say in mixed company. Right. I know. And so we work to then challenge men when we're in same gender company to say that's not OK. Right. I think there are many places, and I've heard students and corporate leaders and nonprofit leaders and education leaders who say, when I go home to my family, when I'm hanging out with my friends, they say things that I'm not OK with. Right. The question becomes, are you silent or do you speak up? Right. We know that there are schools where when there is a challenge, let's say with an African-American student or African-American family or Asian family or Latinx family, there are some places where white faculty get to say, well, I don't know how to handle this. Let me go and find the one faculty of color in our school to handle this situation, versus saying, I've got to skill myself up so that I can be there for all students. Right, that I don't get to tap out and pass, this challenge to someone else. And I think that is, as we see many places where so many organizations are focusing on diversity, and when we see that companies put a diversity council together, for example, and it will be majority people of color, we will oftentimes say, where are your top white leaders? Where's your high potential folks who need to be around the table solving this also, and not just looking for the people of color, if you will, to move diversity forward within the organization. So this has to be something that we do to support everyone in order to maintain and regain our own humanity. And that's it. And that way, I'm not doing it for someone else. I'm really doing it to help myself as well.
How do we make sure things don't go back to normal? How do we keep this momentum going?
Yeah, I think that this is I think that the global pandemic called COVID-19 has put us in a prime space, as Starla said, to not go back to normal, but to create our new normal and our next normal. And many companies are being intentional. Schools are in the process of figuring out, how do we reinvent school? How do we reinvent our workplace, right? And we have just transformed, right? And again, created unprecedented taken unprecedented steps, right, to stay safe and to keep our schools, our organizations, our companies moving forward. We now have the opportunity to also say, how do we make sure that and think intentionally about not reinserting the roots of racism, right? Reinserting those policies and practices, right, that caused us to see some people as more credible than others, right? So as we're intentionally creating our new workspaces, learning spaces, we can add the conversation that says, in what ways do we have institutionalized bias or prejudice or racism in those systems and past practices? We don't have to repeat those going forward. Now, that to me is not an easy task. It can be a very intentional task during a time where we are being very intentional.
Professor Lewis, what do you think about that?
Oh, absolutely. And I think we haven't figured out that learning about each other can be fun. It can be exciting. It can help us feel freer and safer amongst all of us.
Right.
You know, we act like that there are white people who feel comfortable driving into the Black community. And they don't know why they're so uncomfortable. But I know that I chose to live there because it was a very comfortable place to be. It was a very diverse community. I wanted my children to grow up hearing different languages, and I wanted them to grow up hanging out with people of different economic levels, and I wanted them to be comfortable in the world, because literally America is the world. Everybody's here. And if we can figure this thing out, then the whole world can start to get better, because we can be the model. We can be the example. But the world is looking at us now. We don't like what they see. Because they're looking at all our dirty laundry. It was always there. It's not new, but now it's exposed. When I watched a mural being dedicated to George in Germany, I mean, what's wrong with this picture? We're comfortable doing that in other countries that see the injustice because they've experienced their own injustice, and they say, never again. And yet, in our country, because we have refused to look at it, a knee on the throat is no different than a noose around the neck, and it has the exact same outcomes. And we have a history of nooses around necks. I think it was Cornel West who said a Black man was lynched in the United States of America every 2.5 days for 51 years. Nobody cried out. There were no riots. There were no protests. And so I think because we raised a generation of young Americans to believe that all that was in the past, when they saw it with their own eyes, they were outraged. They could not comprehend that this could happen in America. Be shown on television, having a man killing another man in all of his self-righteousness, like it was his privilege to do this, and then have that man literally think that he was not going to be arrested. Had they arrested that man that day, our country wouldn't have gone up in flames.
That's right.
It would not have happened. So that speaks once again to who did it, and then how did they handle what they did?
Yes.
You know, and then they're going to try to blame the protesters. The protesters are just the consequence of the inaction of the leaders in power. So as leaders, and lead is about developing leadership.
That's right.
Each one of the leaders out of lead can educate themselves, can build relationships with different organizations so that they can begin to address a systemic change that needs to happen.
Yeah.
Our children are being miseducated.
Yeah.
They are, and they know it. That's the thing. That's why they're so resistant to school. Yeah. And if we start teaching the truth to the children, I had a young white girl say to me years ago, I'm in a middle school. I was teaching a course on Black history. And she said, why aren't we learning this in school? She said, if we learned this in school, we would treat each other better.
Yeah.
That becomes the challenge.
Yeah. I think the other thing I would say, especially when I think about kind of what do we need and and how do we move forward differently. I think that as we build coalitions in public and private and nonprofit and corporate collaborations, we bring our bias with us. And I have had colleagues who have been part of nonprofit associations and collaborations who have listened to well-intended people make biased and racist comments, guided or protected by humor, right? And when challenged, the person was of course defensive and not willing to look at the impact of their actions. And we say it's important that as we collaborate and as we work together, whether it's across corporate, again, nonprofit, private and public, I think we have to create an environment where we make it a low-risk proposition to help people understand where their actions or statements are biased intentionally or unintentionally. There's a dynamic that we teach that says when people from the majority group and people from the minority group interact with each other, there's a predictable dynamic that oftentimes the people from the majority group on any dimension of diversity will focus on individual acts. And the people from the minority group will track patterns of behaviors when interacting with the majority group. So I'm tracking a pattern, you're tracking an individual act. And we saw this when Colin Kaepernick took a knee saying this was about the pattern of police brutality. And the response was, no, it's not. It's about your individual act and interpreted as being disrespectful. Well, now we're looking at a different type of knee happening, and there's a lot of memes that show which knee upsets you the most, which kneeling upsets you the most. And to me, that's an example of Colin Kaepernick was calling out, Black Lives Matter is calling out the patterns of dehumanization of Black people. And oftentimes many people are only looking at the individual incident, which is why we may hear people saying, this is not about George Floyd, and it is about George Floyd, right? But it's about the pattern. So many people will say, okay, all the officers have been charged and arrested. The charges went from 3rd degree to 2nd degree, and may expect that there's some resolution that calms. And people are going, we're still talking about the pattern. You're thinking that the response to this individual act will calm a reaction to a systemic, historical, present day, and how do we reduce it in the future, right? Pattern, and that's what people are responding to. And I will say, again, to what's making this different, and again, I'll connect to something you said earlier, Starla, people are listening across all races and generations. People are listening and hearing differently and moving to the streets. And as I watch, marches of all or majority light-skinned people or white people marching, right? That says we all are committed to creating a new future together.
I love that sentiment, Dr. Jones, and thank you for breaking all of that down for us and to Professor Lewis. I mean, there is so much unlearning that has to be done. And I see in our chat such a great appetite for knowledge and resources. And I'd love to gather with you two afterwards and put together a reading list, because we've had a few requests for resources and books to read. So perhaps we can send that out to attendees afterwards. Something really resonated with me, Dr. Jones, was when you said that this pandemic it's broken up so much of the way we operate and the way we are, and we've been forced to do that, and we've seen that we could do that, and we have this opportunity when putting everything back together again that we can make some real change, that we know that we can do that, because as you explained, we have made some major changes just through the last few months. What are when we are building those coalitions and when we are talking with our friends and neighbors, what are 2 or 3 things that we should be focused on? I mean, from like a structural policy perspective. I know that people really want to focus their energy on something. They want to be better interpersonally, but they also want to focus their energy on some kind of change. And how do we channel that energy and that passion?
You know, there's an African philosophy that says belief is behavior. So we have to start by getting information to people that is accurate, because that's what's going to shift belief. If I think it was Malcolm X that said, integration without education will never work. And basically what he was saying is, if you take people who don't know each other and you throw them all together, basically what's going to happen is we're going to interact with each other based on the myths, lies, and stereotypes that we've heard about one another.
Right.
If we have truth about ourselves and truth about each other, then we begin to build real, honest, deep, meaningful relationships. We develop genuine caring, because you know who I am. You know, as a child who desegregated a couple of schools, the frustration from my child self was having so many white people to say to me, "You're not like other Black people." And I knew I was like all my cousins because we had the same upbringing. And I was like, well, wait a minute. What does that mean? And what it really means is, you're not like I think Black people are supposed to be. And it's even when you, Stephen, said about the little joke about the guy who was bird watching.
Yes.
But you know, we do everything.
That's right. That's right.
Really. And
That's
so
right.
even then, we need to understand, well, we're programmed to think if I'm doing this, then I'm not being Black.
That's
And the
right.
reality, but we need conversations with listening and learning. And I'm not just talking to white people.
That's right.
Black people don't know very much about Black people either, because we went to the same schools you went to.
Yeah.
We weren't taught much about ourselves either. So the learning is a coming together and learning together. You know, my first job when I graduated from college, I was 24, and I would plan to teach Black studies so that Black people could learn to love themselves. And I ended up in Palomar College in San Marcos in 1974, and I didn't have one Black kid in my class. But what it taught me was that these other people needed the same information that Black people needed. And that in teaching everybody, because we can't assume some people know, some people don't know. You know, Asians don't know about Asians if they never lived in Asia. You know, they just have the same kind. I tried to fit in too. You know, I tried to fit in too. And so we need to say to white people, get comfortable with our diversity, get comfortable with our differences, because you're going to help us get comfortable with it. And then we don't have to use you as the model on how to be human, because we'll recognize we're already human too.
That's right. That's right. I think there are also one strategy is to support organizations that are committed to empowering the Black community. I know we had a question from Jasmine Sadler, and Jasmine has a phenomenal organization called the STEAM Collaborative, right? They could use some funding and financial support. Tracy Morris has a phenomenal organization called Blue Heart Foundation. The Links has an organization called the Links Achievers. There are many organizations in San Diego that could use support, that are committed. Many of you know I'm the former president of the Central San Diego Black Chamber of Commerce. If you're looking for increasing diversity in your employee base and supplier base, connecting with the Central San Diego Black Chamber of Commerce as a resource is a way to build in that institutional commitment, because in many organizations, while their numbers may be high on diversity, in some places, when we look at the number of African Americans, we don't see that same level of success. So there is a unique dynamic happening in response to the African American community that I think this time and space gives us room to say, let's create some dedicated resources, and let's look at the diversity within the diversity as we're moving diversity efforts forward around the city, county, and country, and looking at what's the experience. And I'll just give a quick example. I'm aware of time, we have a number of organizations that are doing focus groups to understand the experience of African Americans in their companies, in their cities, and are finding on their employment engagement surveys and in many other places, the responses of the African American community in their companies is much lower than the experience that other groups are having. So I think there's an opportunity, Elizabeth, when we talk about kind of what can we do institutionally, right, that is to listen to the voices of the current population. Many times people say, I was having a conversation today with an executive who says, I can't recruit diversity into San Diego. And I said, well, first you might want to start off by looking at the diversity that is in San Diego. And then second, you might want to talk to the people who are African American who are working in your organization to find out what brought them to your organization and what causes them to stay in your organization. Right? And so listening and tapping into those voices can be a great part to build some new institutional structures as well.
You know, I would like to share, I have a friend who has a book entitled Love is Just Damn Good Business. And the reality is, we call it a soft skill, but the reality is the most powerful force in the universe. That's what helped Martin Luther King create such an international movement. We have to allow ourselves to use the love that we feel for ourselves, the love that we feel for our loved ones, the love that we feel for our nation, the love that we feel for humanity to manifest in our behavior and in our works. Love is inclusive. It is not exclusive. And so how do we test and measure how we're doing? How much love are we bringing to the table? You know, my great, great, great Aunt Kate lived to be 100 years old. And the wisdom that she gave me allows me to move through racism, sexism, classism, all those other isms, because she taught me how to be my own self-validation. She said, baby, you got to be your own self-validation. People who love themselves are not a danger to anybody else. They're not a threat to anybody else. They're not in competition with anybody else. They're not trying to destroy anybody else. You see what I'm saying? And so we know we live in a nation of people who have not been taught who they are. They have not been taught to embrace who they are. They've been taught to become something else. What do you want to be when you grow up? Nobody asks a child, who you be? Who are you? You see what I'm saying? And building on that, finding passion to build on that, and discovering purpose, and on and on and on. That is our challenge, not only individually, but also as a nation. And I do believe that this nation could be the model for the world on showing the world how to get along. Because why? Because everybody's here.
That's right.
Everybody is here.
Professor, you remind me of my church. We talk about radical love, and I think that you practice that, you live that radical love, and it is so empowering and incredible, and thank you for sharing that with us.
And I just want to say, in spite of racism, in spite of sexism, in spite of injustice, we can't let those things stop us from being the best of who we are.
Right.
I'm so sorry that it's time for us to close, because I could stay here for hours and listen to you too. Thank you to our guests, Starla Lewis and Stephen Jones, for sharing your time and your wisdom and all of your experience with us. Please, everyone, take care of yourselves and each other. And, you know, if we learned anything today, it's to not be afraid to get uncomfortable, to be visible in your feelings, even if it's awkward or messy, to show your love, to show your compassion, to show your solidarity. And please do not let this moment pass without taking some kind of action. Thank you all for being here. And thank you once again to Dr. Stephen Jones and Professor Starla Lewis. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.